Welcome to the channel, Stories of Forgotten Lives. Today's story transports us to 1912, revealing the remarkable journey of Joseph, the sole black man known to have sailed on the Titanic. For decades, his voice was missing from history, until his story shattered the silence 83 years later. This is an emotional and powerful account, so pause for a moment, take a breath, and listen closely. Before we start, remember to subscribe to the channel and leave a comment below telling us your city and country. Your engagement helps keep these hidden stories alive, ensuring they are remembered, not erased. Let's begin. On April 14, 1912, the largest ship ever constructed was speeding across the North Atlantic. The sea was calm, the sky clear, and over 2,000 souls slept peacefully, unaware that within hours most would perish. Among them was a man whose tale would stay concealed for nearly a century. His name was Joseph Philip Lemercier Laroche. He was 25 years old, a trained engineer, fluent in 3 languages, and he was the only black man aboard the RMS Titanic. Yet you've never heard his name in any film. You've never seen his face in any documentary. For 83 years, the world forgot he existed, until his 84-year-old daughter chose to break the silence and share what truly happened that night. This is a story of love, racism, sacrifice, and a promise left unfulfilled. And it starts not on a ship, but on a small Caribbean island, in a house scented with coffee and sea salt. Joseph was born on May 26, 1886, in a coastal city called Cap Haïtien in northern Haiti. At that time, Haiti was still recovering from decades of political turmoil. But Joseph's family was different. They were not poor. They were not struggling. His father was a former military officer with government ties. His mother, Ursule, came from a respected family rooted in Haiti's elite. They lived in a house with wooden shutters and a garden blooming with tropical flowers. Joseph grew up hearing French spoken at the dinner table. His parents believed in education. They believed knowledge was the one thing no one could ever take from you. And from a young age, they saw something special in their son. Joseph was curious. He asked questions about everything. He wanted to understand how things worked. He would dismantle old clocks just to examine the gears inside. He would watch ships dock at the port and wonder how something so heavy could float. His mother noticed this. She knew Haiti at that time could not offer her son the education he deserved. Schools were limited. Opportunities were few, and she had a dream for him. She wanted Joseph to become an engineer. Not just any engineer, a European-trained engineer. Someone who could build bridges and design machines. Someone who could one day return to Haiti and help rebuild the nation. So when Joseph turned 15 in 1901, his mother made a decision that would alter his life forever. She sent him to France. This was no simple trip. In 1901, traveling from Haiti to France took weeks. Joseph boarded a steamship with a small suitcase and a letter of recommendation from his father. He spoke little during the voyage. He spent most of his time on deck watching the horizon, wondering what Europe would be like. He had seen pictures in books. He had heard stories from relatives who visited Paris. But nothing could prepare him for what he was about to experience. When the ship finally docked at Le Havre, Joseph stepped onto French soil for the first time. He was alone. He was 15, and he was black in a country where almost everyone was white. Joseph traveled by train to a city called Beauvais, about 80 km north of Paris. This was where he would study. This was where he would spend the next several years of his life. The city was small, with cobblestone streets and old stone buildings. The winters were cold, far colder than anything Joseph had ever known in Haiti. But he adapted. He found a small room to rent. He enrolled in school and began studying engineering with a focus that impressed his teachers. Joseph wasn't just smart, he was disciplined. He woke early every morning. He studied late into the night. He mastered French grammar until he could write better than most classmates. He learned mathematics, physics, and technical drawing. He wanted to prove that a black man from Haiti could compete with anyone in Europe. But France was not easy for Joseph. People were polite but distant. Some had never seen a black person before. They would stare at him on the street. They would whisper when he entered a room. Joseph learned to ignore it. He focused on his studies. He told himself that once he had his diploma, everything would change. People would respect him for his knowledge, not judge him for his skin. He believed this completely. And for a while, it seemed he was right. Joseph earned his engineering degree in the early 1900s. He was proud. His mother was proud. He had done exactly what she dreamed. But when Joseph began looking for work, he discovered something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. No one wanted to hire a black engineer. It didn't matter that he had the same diploma as everyone else. It didn't matter that he spoke perfect French. It didn't matter that he was intelligent and hardworking. When employers saw his face, they suddenly had no positions open. Applications were ignored. At interviews, he was told the job had already been filled. Joseph applied to dozens of companies. Engineering firms, construction companies, government offices. The answer was always the same. No. This was France in the early 1900s. Racism wasn't written into law as it was in America. There were no whites only signs. No separate water fountains or train cars. But discrimination existed in quieter ways. It existed in the way people looked at you. It existed in the opportunities never offered. It existed in the doors forever closed. Joseph felt it every single day, and it was breaking him. He eventually found work, but not the kind he trained for. He took small jobs, low-paying roles that didn't require his engineering skills. He worked harder than anyone, hoping someone would notice his talent. But promotions never came. Raises never came. He was always passed over for white colleagues with less experience and education. Joseph was stuck, and he was losing hope. But then something happened that changed everything. In the city of Villejuif, just south of Paris, Joseph met a young woman named Juliette Marie-Louise Lafargue. She was the daughter of a local wine merchant. She had brown hair, soft eyes, and a smile that made Joseph forget his troubles. Juliette was white. Her family was French, and in 1908, falling in love with a black man was not socially accepted. But Juliette didn't care about society. She cared about Joseph. She saw the man behind the skin color. She saw his intelligence, his kindness, his determination, and she fell in love with him completely. They met through a family friend who had mentored Joseph. At first, their conversations were polite, formal. But as weeks turned to months, something deeper grew. Joseph would visit Juliette's home. They would walk together through Villejuif streets. They would talk about books, dreams, the future. Joseph had never met anyone like her. She was curious about Haiti. She wanted to know about his childhood, his mother, the ships he watched at the port. She listened to him as no one else ever had. Juliette's father was unhappy about the relationship. A wine merchant in France had a reputation to protect. His daughter marrying a black man would cause scandal. It would hurt his business. It would make the family the subject of gossip. But Juliette was stubborn. She told her father she loved Joseph. She told him she would marry him whether he approved or not. And eventually, her father relented. Perhaps he saw how happy Joseph made his daughter. Perhaps he realized fighting her was futile. On March 18, 1908, Joseph Philippe Lemercier Laroche and Juliette Marie-Louise Lafargue were married in a small ceremony. Joseph was 21, Juliette was 20. And despite every obstacle, they were finally together. The first years of their marriage were happy but difficult. Joseph still struggled to find proper work. The discrimination hadn't stopped. If anything, it worsened. Now he wasn't just a black man. He was a black man with a white wife. Some people couldn't accept it. They treated him with open contempt. They refused to do business with him. They made life as hard as possible. But Joseph and Juliet survived. They rented a small apartment. They lived modestly. And on February 19, 1909, their first daughter was born. They named her Simone. She had her mother's eyes and her father's smile. Joseph held her and cried. He promised himself he would give this child a better life. He would find a way. A year later, on July 2, 1910, their second daughter was born. They named her Louise. But unlike Simone, Louise was not a healthy baby. She was born premature. She was small and weak. Doctors said she might not survive. Joseph and Juliet spent weeks at her bedside praying, hoping, refusing to give up. Slowly, little Louise grew stronger. She survived, but her medical problems continued. She needed constant care. She needed expensive treatments. And Joseph, with his limited income, struggled to pay for everything. The situation grew desperate. Joseph worked long hours at jobs that barely covered rent. Juliet cared for 2 small children while pregnant with a third. Yes, by early 1912, Juliet had discovered she was expecting another baby. This should have been happy news. But for Joseph, it was one more reason to worry. How could he support 3 children on his salary? How could he pay for Louise's care? How could he give his family the life they deserved? Then Joseph had an idea. He would return to Haiti. It made perfect sense. In Haiti, Joseph would not be judged by his skin color. In Haiti, his engineering degree would mean something. His family had connections. His mother was still alive and respected. He could find work. He could build a real career. He could give his children opportunities France would never offer. Joseph discussed his plan with Juliet. At first, she hesitated. She had never been to Haiti. She didn't speak Creole. She would be leaving her family, her country, everything she knew. But she trusted Joseph. She believed in him, and she agreed to go. Joseph wrote to his mother in Haiti explaining the situation. His mother was overjoyed. She had missed her son terribly. She had always hoped he would return, and she immediately offered to help. She would buy the family tickets to Haiti. She would ensure they had everything they needed upon arrival. Joseph felt a weight lift from his shoulders. For the first time in years, he had hope. The original plan was to leave France in late 1912 or early 1913. But when Juliet discovered her pregnancy, Joseph moved the timeline forward. He didn't want her traveling when the pregnancy was too advanced. He wanted the baby born in Haiti, surrounded by family. His mother purchased first-class tickets for the family aboard a French ocean liner called the SS France. The ship was scheduled to depart in April 1912. Everything was arranged. Everything was perfect. But then Joseph learned something that changed everything. The SS France had a strict policy regarding children. All children traveling were required to stay in the nursery during meals. They were not allowed to dine with their parents. Joseph found this unacceptable. Simone was 3. Louise was not yet 2. They were babies. He couldn't imagine leaving them alone with strangers while he and Juliet ate in some fancy dining room. It went against everything he believed as a father. He wanted to be with his daughters. He wanted to see their faces trying new foods. He wanted to hold Louise if she got scared. The SS France's policy was cruel and unnecessary, and Joseph refused to accept it. He went to the ticket office and asked for a refund. Then he started looking for another ship. And that's when he learned about the Titanic. The RMS Titanic was the largest ship in the world, brand new. On its maiden voyage from Southampton, England, to New York City, Everyone was talking about it. Newspapers called it unsinkable. They said it was a floating palace with luxuries no other ship could match. First-class passengers had access to a gymnasium, a swimming pool, Turkish baths, and restaurants rivaling Paris's finest. Even second-class accommodations were said to be better than first class on other ships. And most importantly, the Titanic didn't have the same restrictive policies about children. Joseph could dine with his daughters. He could spend time with them during the voyage. He could be the father he wanted to be. Joseph exchanged the first-class tickets on the SS France for second-class tickets on the Titanic. The family would board the ship at Cherbourg, France, on April 10, 1912. From there, they would sail to New York. And from New York, they would take another ship to Haiti. It was a longer journey, but Joseph didn't mind. He was excited. He was finally taking his family home. The days before departure were busy. Juliet packed their belongings. Joseph arranged their apartment affairs. He said goodbye to the few friends he'd made in France. He wrote letters to relatives in Haiti telling them to expect the family soon. Simone and Louise didn't understand what was happening. They were too young. But they sensed the excitement in the air. Their father smiled more than usual. Their mother sang as she folded clothes. Something wonderful was about to happen. On the morning of April 10, 1912, the Laroche family traveled by train to Cherbourg. Cherbourg was a port city on France's northern coast, famous for its deep harbor. The Titanic was too large to dock at the pier, so passengers were transported to the ship on smaller boats called tenders. The tender carrying the Laroche family was called the SS Nomadic, a sturdy little vessel painted white with the White Star Line flag flying from its mast. Joseph carried Louise in his arms as they boarded. Simone held her mother's hand, looking around with wide eyes. Dozens of other passengers were on the boat, speaking different languages, wearing expensive clothes. Some looked at the Laroche family with curiosity. Some looked with something else. Joseph noticed. He always noticed, but he didn't let it bother him. Not today. Today was the beginning of a new life. As the tender approached the Titanic, Joseph saw the ship for the first time, and he stopped breathing. It was enormous, like nothing he had ever seen. The hull rose from the water like a black iron wall, stretching so high Joseph had to tilt his head back to see the top. 4 massive smokestacks pointed toward the sky, painted in the White Star Line's distinctive buff, yellow with black tops. The ship was longer than any building Joseph had ever entered. It looked permanent, invincible, like something that could never, ever sink. The tender pulled alongside, and passengers began climbing a gangway to the second-class entrance. Joseph helped Juliet, now visibly pregnant. He carried Louise, who had fallen asleep on his shoulder. Simone walked between her parents, clutching her favorite doll. The family stepped onto the Titanic around 6:30 in the evening. The sun was beginning to set. The ship's orchestra played somewhere in the distance, and Joseph Laroche, the only black man on board, took a deep breath and smiled. They had made it. Their cabin was on Deck E in the second-class section. It was small but comfortable. 2 beds, a wash basin, and a porthole overlooking the ocean. The walls were white. The linens were clean. Compared to their apartment in France, it felt almost luxurious. Juliet sat on the bed and exhaled. The journey had been exhausting. The pregnancy made her tired, but she was happy. She looked at Joseph and reached for his hand. That first night, the family ate dinner together in the second-class dining saloon. The room was beautiful. Oak-paneled walls, white tablecloths, crystal glasses. Waiters in crisp uniforms moved between tables, serving course after course. Simone was fascinated by everything. Louise slept in her mother's arms. Joseph ordered food he'd never tried before. He laughed at something Juliet said. For a few hours, he forgot the discrimination. He forgot the struggles. He was just a father having dinner with his family on the world's most famous ship. But not everyone was welcoming. Some passengers in the dining room stared at the LaRoche family. A black man with a white wife and two mixed-race children was an uncommon sight in 1912. Some whispered. Some pointed. Joseph heard fragments of conversation. Words not meant for him, but he understood perfectly. He pretended not to notice. He focused on Juliet. He focused on his daughters. He refused to let anyone ruin this moment. Over the next few days, the family settled into a routine. Joseph would wake early and walk the deck, breathing the salt air, watching the endless ocean stretch to the horizon. Juliet stayed in the cabin with the children, reading, playing games, resting. They would meet for meals. They would talk about Haiti. Joseph told Juliet about the beaches, the mountains, the house where he grew up. He told her about the food his mother made. He told her about the sound of drums during carnival. Juliet listened to every word. She was falling in love with a country she'd never seen. Other passengers continued to treat the LaRoches with curiosity and coolness. Some assumed the children weren't actually theirs. One woman reportedly thought Simone and Louise were Japanese because of their light brown skin and dark hair. Joseph overheard comments in English and French. He understood both perfectly, but he never responded. He never confronted anyone. He simply held his head high and kept walking. His entire life had been dealing with people who thought they were better. He wouldn't waste energy on them now. On Sunday, April 14, 1912, the LaRoches attended a church service in the second-class dining room, a brief non-denominational service led by Captain Edward Smith. Passengers sang hymns, they prayed. They gave thanks for the beautiful weather and smooth voyage. Joseph sat with his family in a back row. He wasn't particularly religious, but he appreciated the moment of peace. He closed his eyes and thought of his mother in Haiti. He imagined her face seeing him again. He imagined her holding her grandchildren for the first time. In just a few more days, they would be together. After the service, Joseph did something unusual. He went to the second-class smoking room, a space where men gathered to talk, drink, and play cards. Joseph rarely socialized with strangers. He preferred spending time with Juliet and the children. But something made him go that day. Perhaps he wanted to relax. Perhaps he wanted to feel normal, like any other passenger. He found a seat in the corner. He ordered a drink. He watched the other men laughing and joking. And for a moment, he felt he belonged. That evening, the family had their final dinner together. The menu included lamb, roast beef, vegetables, and desserts. Simone ate everything on her plate. Louise was fussy as usual. Juliet looked tired but content. Joseph looked at his family across the table and felt a surge of love so powerful it almost hurt. These three people were everything to him. He had crossed oceans for them. He had endured discrimination for them. He would do anything to keep them safe. After dinner, Juliet took the children back to the cabin. Joseph kissed each goodnight. He told Simone to be good. He told Louise that Papa loved her. He told Juliet he would come to bed soon. Then he returned to the smoking room. He wanted to enjoy the voyage's last peaceful hours. Tomorrow they would arrive in New York. Tomorrow the real journey would begin. At 11:40 p.m., Joseph felt a slight shudder run through the ship. He looked up from his drink. Other men in the smoking room felt it too. Someone joked about hitting a whale. Someone else laughed nervously. The ship's engine seemed to stop. The room grew very quiet. Joseph stood up. Something was wrong. He could feel it in his bones. He walked out of the smoking room onto the deck. The night was freezing. The stars were incredibly bright. Scattered across the deck were pieces of ice, small chunks like broken glass glittering in the light from the ship's windows. Joseph picked one up. It was cold and wet in his hand. He looked toward the bow and saw something that made his heart stop. A massive wall of white was scraping along the starboard side. An iceberg. Joseph dropped the ice and ran toward his cabin. Joseph ran through the ship's corridors like a man possessed. His heart pounded in his throat. His breath came in sharp, burning gasps. The hallways, once elegant and welcoming, now felt like a maze designed to trap him. He turned left. He turned right. He nearly collided with a steward walking calmly the opposite way, as if nothing had happened, as if the world wasn't ending. The steward was young, maybe 20, with a pale face and a crisp white uniform. He told Joseph not to worry. He said the ship had struck some ice, but everything was under control. He said passengers should return to their cabins and wait for instructions. His voice was steady. His hands weren't shaking. But Joseph saw something in his eyes, something that contradicted every word. Fear, pure, undeniable fear. Joseph didn't believe him. He pushed past the steward and kept running. Corridors were filling with confused passengers, some in nightgowns and pajamas, hair disheveled, eyes heavy with interrupted sleep. Others fully dressed, carrying suitcases and valuables, as if preparing to disembark at a scheduled port. A woman cried nearby. A child asked questions no one could answer. The ship's lights flickered once, twice, then steadied. Joseph felt the floor tilt slightly, almost imperceptibly, toward the bow. Something was very, very wrong. When he reached the cabin on Deck E, he threw open the door with such force it slammed against the wall. Juliet sat up in bed, eyes wide with confusion and dawning terror. Her hands pressed against her pregnant belly, as if to protect the child inside. The children still slept. Louise was curled in her small bed, thumb in her mouth, breathing slow and peaceful. Simone was sprawled across her mattress, one arm hanging over the edge, her favorite doll clutched to her chest. The impact had been so gentle, so deceptively mild. It hadn't disturbed their dreams. Juliet asked Joseph what was happening. Her voice was calm, controlled, a woman trying hard not to panic. But Joseph saw fear forming behind her eyes. He saw her hands tremble slightly as she pushed the blankets aside. He told her to get dressed. He told her to dress the children warmly. He told her they needed to go to the deck immediately. He didn't explain why. There was no time for explanations. No time for questions. Every second wasted in that cabin was a second closer to disaster. Juliet moved quickly. She was 7 months pregnant, her body heavy and slow. But adrenaline gave her strength she didn't know she had. She pulled a thick wool coat over her nightgown. She grabbed scarves and hats from the small wardrobe. She wrapped Simone in a blanket, lifting the sleepy child with a mother's practiced efficiency. Simone murmured unintelligibly and nestled against her mother's shoulder. Louise was harder to wake. She whimpered and cried when Juliet lifted her, her small body stiff with protest. But there was no time for comfort. No time for soothing words. Joseph grabbed the life jackets stored in the cabin. He had noticed them when they first boarded, tucked in a corner near the wardrobe, and thought nothing of them. They seemed a formality, a precaution for a danger that would never come. The Titanic was unsinkable. Everyone said so. The newspapers said so. The company said so. The captain probably believed it. But now, those life jackets were the most important objects in the world. Joseph pulled them out and examined them quickly. They were made of cork, covered in white canvas, with straps tying around the chest and waist. They were bulky and uncomfortable, but they would keep a person afloat. They would buy time. Joseph helped Juliet into her life jacket. his fingers fumbling with unfamiliar straps. He fastened one around Simone, now fully awake and beginning to cry. He held Louise while Juliet adjusted the straps on her own jacket, the little girl squirming and wailing in his arms. She didn't understand what was happening. She didn't understand why her father's hands shook. She only knew something was wrong. Something was different, and she was scared. The family left the cabin and made their way toward the upper decks. Corridors were more crowded now. Passengers emerged from rooms, some moving with purpose, others frozen in confusion. Stewards were everywhere, voices artificially calm, instructions maddeningly vague. Please proceed to the boat deck. Please put on your life jackets. Please remain calm. But how could anyone remain calm when the floor tilted? How could anyone remain calm when the lights flickered? How could anyone remain calm when the greatest ship ever built was dying beneath their feet? Joseph led his family through the maze of corridors, up staircases growing more crowded each minute. He held Louise in one arm and pulled Juliet with the other. Simone clung to her mother's coat, small legs struggling to keep up, face pale with terror. The sounds around them were overwhelming. Crying, shouting, praying. The distant crash of something heavy falling deep in the ship. The groan of metal under stress. And beneath it all, a horrible, subtle sound Joseph would remember for the rest of his life. The sound of water rushing, pouring, unstoppable water flooding the lower decks. When they finally reached the boat deck, Joseph understood the full scope of the disaster. The deck was chaos. Hundreds of passengers gathered near the lifeboats, pushing, shoving, crying, praying. Officers in white uniforms shouted orders no one seemed to hear. Crew members struggled with ropes and pulleys, trying to lower boats into the water. Women screamed for husbands. Children cried for parents. The cold was brutal, far worse than anything Joseph had known in France. The temperature was below freezing, every breath like swallowing ice. The stars above were impossibly bright, indifferent to the suffering below. And the ship's orchestra was playing. Joseph could hardly believe it. In the middle of this nightmare, a group of musicians stood on deck, instruments in hand, playing cheerful melodies as if at a garden party. The music was surreal, almost offensive in its normalcy. It clashed violently with the screams and chaos, creating a dissonance that made the scene feel like a fever dream. Later, Joseph would learn the orchestra was instructed to play to keep passengers calm. Later, he would understand the bravery of those musicians performing as the ship sank. But in that moment, the music only made everything worse. Joseph pushed through the crowd, eyes scanning the lifeboats. He needed to find one still loading. He needed to get his family off this ship. The Titanic was sinking. He could feel it now. The unmistakable tilt of the deck, the shift of gravity beneath his feet. The bow was going down. The stern was rising. Time was running out. He spotted a lifeboat on the port side. An officer stood nearby calling for passengers. Women and children first, he kept shouting. Women and children first. It was the rule of the sea, the code of honor. Men would wait. Men would find another way. Men would die so women and children could live. Joseph understood the rule. He accepted it. But accepting it didn't make it easier. Juliet looked at Joseph, tears streaming down her face. The cold wind bit her cheeks, turning her skin red and raw. She didn't want to leave him. She grabbed his arm with strength he didn't know she possessed, her fingers digging into his coat, her eyes pleading with him to come. Joseph shook his head. He couldn't. He knew he couldn't. The officer was watching. The rules were clear. If Joseph tried to board, he would be stopped. He would be thrown back. He might even be shot. He had heard stories of officers using guns to maintain order during shipwrecks. He wouldn't risk it. He wouldn't risk his family's chance to survive. He told Juliet he would find another way. He told her there were more lifeboats on the other side. He told her he would see her in New York. He told her to be strong, to take care of the children, to never forget how much he loved her. His voice was steady, but inside he was breaking. Inside he was screaming. He didn't want to let her go. He didn't want to watch his family disappear into darkness. But he had no choice. The officer gestured impatiently for Juliet to board. Other women were already climbing in, faces white with fear, movements clumsy and desperate. Juliet hesitated. She looked at Joseph one more time, memorizing his face, burning his image into memory. He held Louise in his arms. The little girl's face pressed against his shoulder, her small body shaking with cold and fear. Simone stood between them, looking up at her parents with eyes that didn't understand. Joseph handed Louise to Juliet. The transfer was awkward, complicated by life jackets, the crowd, the rocking ship. Louise wailed as she passed from her father's arms to her mother's. Joseph kissed his daughter's forehead, his lips lingering on her cold skin. He whispered that Papa loved her. He whispered everything would be okay. Then he lifted Simone and placed her in the lifeboat next to her mother. The 3-year-old immediately started crying, reaching for her father with both arms, her small voice cutting through the chaos like a knife. But something went wrong. In the confusion and crowd, the lifeboat began to lower before everyone was properly seated. Juliet and Simone were pushed to one side by the surge of boarding passengers, while Louise was still in Joseph's arms. He had handed her to Juliet, but somehow in the chaos, the child had been passed back. Or perhaps he hadn't let go. Perhaps he held her 1 second too long, savoring his daughter's weight in his arms, not realizing the boat was already descendant. The ropes creaked. The pulleys groaned. The lifeboat dropped several feet, then stopped, swinging slightly in the frigid air. Juliet screamed. She could see Louise still on deck, still in Joseph's arms, getting farther away each second. She reached out, arms stretched toward her baby, face twisted with anguish almost inhuman. Joseph tried to push forward, but there were too many people. Bodies pressed against him from every direction. A crewman blocked his path, arms spread wide, face hard and suspicious. The crewman saw a black man trying to approach the lifeboat and assumed the worst. He thought Joseph was trying to board. He thought Joseph was taking a place belonging to women and children. He didn't see a father trying to reunite his family. He saw a threat. Joseph shouted. He begged. He pointed at Juliet in the lifeboat. He pointed at Louise in his arms. "That is her mother," he said. "This is her daughter. Please let me give her the baby." But the crewman didn't move. The crewman didn't listen. Seconds ticked away. The lifeboat was descending, and Louise was still on the deck of the sinking ship. In that moment, Joseph made a decision that would haunt Juliet for the rest of her life. He turned to a stranger standing next to him, a woman he had never seen before and would never see again, and thrust Louise into her arms. The woman was startled, confused, but Joseph gave her no time to react. He begged her to pass the child to the woman in the boat. He pointed at Juliet, whose screams were now so loud they could be heard over the chaos. "That is her mother," he said. Please give her the baby. Save my daughter." The stranger looked at the crying child in her arms. She looked at the lifeboat descending into darkness. She looked at the black man with tears streaming down his face. And then she did something Joseph would never be able to thank her for. She leaned over the railing and passed Louise down to another passenger below, who passed her to another and another. A chain of strangers united by a single purpose: until finally the little girl reached Juliet's outstretched arms. Mother and daughter were reunited. The lifeboat continued to descend. Joseph stood at the railing and watched his family disappear into darkness. The lifeboat hit the black water with a splash impossibly loud in the night stillness. Crew members began rowing, pulling away from the sinking ship, putting distance between themselves and disaster. Joseph could see Juliet's face in the dim light, growing smaller as the boat moved away. Their eyes met across the growing distance. She was crying. She held both daughters against her chest, one in each arm, as if she could protect them from the whole world. She mouthed something to him. He couldn't hear the words over the wind and chaos, but he understood. She was telling him she loved him. She was telling him to survive. She was telling him to find a way. Joseph raised his hand in a final wave. He tried to smile. He wanted her last memory of him to be a smile. He wanted her to remember him as brave, strong, hopeful. He didn't want her to see the terror in his heart. He didn't want her to know he had already accepted his fate. The lifeboat disappeared into darkness, and Joseph was alone. He didn't move for a long time. He stood at the railing, hands gripping cold metal, eyes fixed on the spot where the lifeboat vanished. The Titanic listed badly now, tilting forward at an angle making it difficult to stand. Water poured into lower decks through gashes in the hull. The bow sank. The stern rose. The great ship was dying, and nothing could save it. Around Joseph, chaos continued. Passengers ran in every direction, searching for lifeboats already gone. Officers fired guns into the air, trying to maintain order. Men jumped into freezing water, preferring a quick death to slow agony. The orchestra had stopped playing. The lights flickered more frequently now, casting the deck in alternating brightness and shadow. The screams of the dying and desperate filled the air like a symphony of despair. Joseph walked back toward the second-class smoking room. He didn't know why. Perhaps he wanted somewhere familiar. Perhaps he wanted away from crowds and screaming. Perhaps he needed a moment to think, to process, to accept what was happening. The smoking room was nearly empty when he arrived. A few men sat at tables drinking whiskey, playing cards, waiting for the end. They had accepted their fate. They knew there weren't enough lifeboats. They knew the water was freezing. They knew even if they jumped, they wouldn't survive more than minutes. So they sat and drank and waited. Joseph sat in the same chair where he had sat just 2 hours before. The same chair where he dreamed of Haiti. The same chair where he imagined his mother's face seeing him again. He thought of Juliet. He thought of Simone and Louise. He thought of the baby Juliet carried, the child who would never know its father. He thought of his mother in Haiti, who would receive a letter in weeks telling her son was dead. He thought of all he would never do, all the places he would never see, all the moments he would never share with the people he loved. And he thought of the life he had lived. 25 years. That was all he'd been given. 25 years of struggle, discrimination, fighting for every opportunity. He left Haiti a boy and crossed an ocean for an education. He studied harder than anyone, worked longer than anyone, and still it wasn't enough. The color of his skin followed him everywhere, closing doors that should have been open, denying him chances others took for granted. He had loved and been loved. He married a woman who saw past his color, who loved him for who he was. He fathered 2 beautiful daughters and expected a third. He tried so hard to build a good life, a meaningful life, and now it ended on a sinking ship in the middle of the Atlantic. Joseph closed his eyes. He thought of Juliet in the lifeboat, holding their daughters close. He imagined them rescued. He imagined them arriving in New York, traveling to Haiti, starting a new life without him. He imagined his children growing up, going to school, falling in love, having children of their own. He imagined Juliet growing old, her hair turning gray, her face lined with years. He hoped she would find happiness. He hoped she would find peace. He hoped she would tell their children about him, about the father who loved them more than life itself. At 20:20 a.m. on April 15, 1912, the RMS Titanic broke apart and sank beneath the North Atlantic waves. The sound was unlike anything survivors had ever heard. A deep groaning roar as the ship tore in two. A thunderous crash as the bow plunged into the depths. A moment of eerie silence as the stern rose vertical, pointing at the stars like a dark finger accusing the heavens. And then the screams. Hundreds and hundreds of screams as over 500 people plunged into water so cold it stopped hearts within minutes. Joseph Philippe Lemercier Laroche was among the dead. His body was never recovered. Lifeboats drifted in darkness for hours, surrounded by cries of the dying. Passengers huddled together for warmth, bodies shaking with cold and shock. Some prayed. Some wept. Some stared into darkness with empty eyes, unable to process what they witnessed. Screams from the water gradually faded as cold claimed its victims. Within an hour, there was only silence, a terrible, absolute silence swallowing the whole world. Juliet held her daughters close all night. She didn't sleep. She didn't speak. She simply held Simone and Louise against her body, trying to keep them warm, trying to keep them alive. Her eyes never left the horizon. She kept hoping to see Joseph in another lifeboat. She kept telling herself he found a way to survive. He was smart. He was resourceful. He promised they would meet again in New York. Joseph never broke a promise to her. He wouldn't start now. But as hours passed, hope began to fade. Other lifeboats came together, sharing survivors, sharing information, sharing grief. No one had seen Joseph. No one had seen a black man in any boat. Juliet's heart sank with each passing minute. She began to understand what she'd refused to accept. Her husband was gone. The father of her children was gone. The man she loved since she was a girl was at the bottom of the Atlantic. Around 4 a.m., survivors saw lights on the horizon. A ship approached. It was the RMS Carpathia, a Cunard liner that received Titanic's distress signal and changed course immediately, racing through the night at full speed, navigating the same ice field that destroyed Titanic. Carpathia's captain pushed his ship to its limits, arriving in just over 3 hours, a journey that should have taken longer. His decision saved hundreds of lives. Carpathia began picking up survivors from lifeboats one by one. Rope ladders lowered over the side. Crew members reached down to pull freezing passengers aboard. Some survivors were so weak they had to be carried. Some were unconscious. Some were children separated from parents in chaos who would never see them again. Juliet and her daughters were among the 706 survivors rescued by Carpathia. When Juliet climbed aboard, she immediately searched for Joseph. She walked through crowds of survivors, eyes scanning every face, voice calling his name. She asked officers if they'd seen a black man. She described him in detail. His height, his clothes, the engineering books he always carried, his smile that lit up his face. No one had seen him. No one could help. As hours passed, as Carpathia completed its rescue and turned toward New York, Juliet's hope died completely. She sat on the deck, surrounded by crying widows and traumatized children, and accepted her husband was gone. Carpathia arrived in New York the night of April 18, 1912. Over 30,000 people waited at the pier. Reporters with cameras, family members holding photographs, curious onlookers hoping to glimpse history. Rain fell, a cold drizzle matching the crowd's mood. Juliet walked down the gangway with Simone in one hand, Louise in the other. She was 25 years old. She was 7 months pregnant. She was a widow. And she was utterly, completely alone. Charitable organizations took her in. The Women's Relief Committee provided money and clothes. The French consulate helped with paperwork and translation. Everyone was kind. Everyone was sympathetic. But kindness couldn't bring Joseph back. Sympathy couldn't fill the empty space beside her in bed. Juliette stayed in New York several weeks, waiting, hoping, refusing to leave in case Joseph was somehow still alive. But no news came. No body was ever found. Finally, she decided. She would not stay in America. She would not continue to Haiti. She would go home to France, to her family, to the only place she might find some peace. In May 1912, Juliette and her daughters boarded another ship and sailed back across the Atlantic. The journey was a nightmare. Every creak of the hull made her flinch. Every swell made her think of that night. Simone had screaming nightmares. Louise cried constantly, sensing her mother's grief, even if she couldn't understand it. By the time they reached France, all three were broken. Juliette's family welcomed her with open arms. Her father held her while she wept. Her mother cared for the children. No one asked questions. No one forced her to talk. They simply surrounded her with love and waited for her to heal. On December 17, 1912, 8 months after Titanic sank, Juliette gave birth to her third child, a boy. She named him Joseph Philippe Lemercier Laroche Jr., after the father he would never know. The baby was healthy and strong. He had his father's eyes, dark, intelligent, full of life. Juliette held her son and cried because he was beautiful, and because Joseph would never see him. Juliette never remarried. She dedicated her life to raising her 3 children, working multiple jobs to support them, sacrificing her own happiness for their future. She never forgot Joseph. Every year on the sinking's anniversary, she lit a candle and sat alone in darkness, remembering. She never spoke publicly about Titanic. The trauma was too deep, the wounds too raw. When reporters came for interviews, she turned them away. When filmmakers offered money for her story, she refused. She built a wall around that night, and she wouldn't let anyone tear it down. The children grew up in the shadow of their father's absence. Simone remembered fragments. The cold, the screams, her father's face at the railing. Louise remembered nothing, only what her mother told her. And Joseph Jr. never knew his father at all. Only the stories. Only the photographs. Only the weight of a name carrying so much history. Decades passed. The world changed. 2 world wars came and went. Titanic became legend, the subject of books, films, endless fascination. But Joseph Laroche's name never appeared. His face was never shown. His story was never told. History erased him, as it erased so many others who didn't fit the narrative. Juliette died in 1980 at age 91, her silence unbroken. Simone died a few years later, taking her memories to the grave. Only Louise remained. In 1995, Louise Laroche was 84 years old. She lived in Paris in a small apartment filled with photographs and memories. She lived a long life. She had seen everything, and she was tired of silence. When a representative from the Titanic Historical Society contacted her asking for her story, she said yes. The interview lasted hours. Louise told them everything. Her father's childhood in Haiti, his education in France, the discrimination, the marriage, the decision to immigrate, the exchange of tickets. The night of April 14th, the chaos, the separation, the stranger who passed her hand to hand. Her mother's grief, her brother born 8 months later, carrying his father's name. For the first time in 83 years, the world heard the story of Joseph Philippe Lemercier Laroche. Louise died on January 28, 1998, at age 87. She was one of Titanic's last survivors. But before she went, she ensured her father would never be forgotten again. Today, Joseph Laroche's name appears in museums. His photograph hangs in exhibitions. His story is taught in schools. He is no longer invisible, no longer erased. He was a father who loved his family. He was a man who fought injustice. He was the only black passenger on Titanic, and his story will echo through history forever.